welcome. Let's get this party started, right? So good to see you here tonight. On behalf of OBHS, thank you for joining us for another evening in our Let's Talk History series. We're so grateful for this partnership and for the opportunity to gather in this beautiful space to learn about women in the American Revolution. As a matter of fact, little side story, my kids did not always get along really well when they were younger, but they're meeting tonight for trivia night. If they get any women on Arnold's March questions, they're going to call me. I'm going to have to leave. All right? But we'll see how that goes. So I'd like to begin, as always, with a few thank yous. First of all, First Parish Federated Church, thank you for opening your doors to us in this beautiful space. And Alex, our super sound man up there, and video, we couldn't do it without you. Thank you to Sally Hunter and her team of bakers. Raise your hand if you baked. I forgot to get everybody's name. Thank you. I've tried 3 things so far. They're all great. And thank you for Melody for gathering all of our supplies and getting them here for us. Our longtime sponsor, Kennebunk Savings Bank, 25 years of sponsoring these little talks for us. Brad Fletcher, organizer extraordinaire, who brings us these great talks full of wonderful speakers every month. No pressure at all, right? Special thank you to Peter Mishu over here. He is our new collections committee chair, and he also does all our fabulous social media. What is really helpful to us as an organization is if you like and share his posts, because that really boosts our, engagement? Engagement, boosts our engagement. So, and of course, thank you all for being here tonight. We really appreciate this. I also want to share how excited we are about this year's Hike Through History. We are working with high school students for the first time in about 20 years. So I've been in to see 2 AP classes and 3 sophomore honors classes, and we are doing topics from, the theme is a day in the life. And what the goal is to show what a day in the life of, like, a sea captain from Southburg who's been captured by pirates not once but twice, like this guy. Also by Placide Gagnon, who was an iceman and delivered ice and then coke, coal, and eventually oil. All the way from those 2 guys to Sarah Frost, who owned the Stagehouse Inn when it was the Frost Tavern, to teenagers at Teen Haven in 1962. So it should be an interesting day. Any Teen Haven people here? Woo! You know, fun fact, without Teen Haven, there would be no Nicole. It's where my parents met. That's where my parents met, at Teen Haven. Yes. And I know, fun fact. That's when you know you live in a small town, right? All right. More information is we are having our annual meeting on May 28th at 7 o'clock down at the museum. And it was a TBD in your program, and this is what the TBD is we are unveiling our new archive library, which is freshly painted, reorganized, and we are going to dedicate those archives to Wendy Persig on May 28th. So, rightfully so. So Peter and I are cooking up some fun things for Wendy, and she will be in attendance. So please come. We'll do the ceremony. We're doing sort of an open house format. We're going to do the ceremony probably 7:15-ish. We'll have our usual refreshments, etc. But we'll all sort of gather around informally for our informally formal dedication. Also, hopefully, we will have some Marshwood High School students who want to do a pop-up exhibit on South Berwick's connection to the Salem witch trials. So they are very excited about that, and are working possibly with this guy and with Tad with questions. So that could be happening as well. If not, we have other surprises in store for you. So it should be a fun evening. Thought I could get through it without my glasses, but cannot. All right. At the Old Berwick Historical Society, we believe that every story lives. And evenings like this remind us just how rich and meaningful those stories are when we come together to share them. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Brad to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. Okay. Is it on? Okay. Hello? 1, 2. Okay. I don't need this, but they said for the audio, we need to use this. So last fall, we just had a program on the Penobscot expedition. We're kind of trying to get some programs to celebrate this anniversary of the American Revolutionary War. And as I was, there's not a ton of it that happened in Maine, but there are some key events. And the first one that came to mind was the Arnold expedition up the Kennebec to Quebec. And so I started thinking, okay, I'll find speakers. There have to be speakers. There are speakers. And I really didn't find speakers. I found the Arnold Expedition Historical Society. They didn't get back to me, but there is that, and there's some activity around this. And then to my great luck, I discovered that, I can't remember what day it was, but 48 hours from that point, there was going to be an Arnold Expedition conference, a one-day conference in Augusta at Fort Western. So I said to my wife, who's always up for a good time, I said, let's go to Augusta. So we did. It was a good time. And I couldn't stay for all of the programs, but we stayed for a number of them. And I went there looking for a speaker. I just wanted somebody who could come here and do this. And there was exactly one, and she's here tonight, who I thought was fabulous. Sara Donovan is a reenactor. She is a living historian. She is an avid hiker. She's an outdoors woman. And her talk on the women of Arnold's expedition, I thought was passionate, and she brought her experience to it. And I thought it was fascinating. And I left thinking, because she kept saying, I'm not a historian, that I left thinking, there's no way I'm going to get this woman to come down here and do this. But she is here. And she's actually taken a little bit on the road. She's done some other historical societies. So I think we're in for a treat. So I'm also playing Harlan Goodwin tonight. So I'm going to run this, and then when this is done, I'm going to run back and turn on lights. So I'm going to be a necessary distraction at times. But would you please welcome Sara Donovan? There you go, man.
Thank you. And I just want to say thanks to Brad, I have become a researcher, a reluctant researcher. Seriously. So I can thank you for that. So I'm going to start with, at Brad's suggestion, a brief history of what Arnold's March meant in the Revolutionary War. So next slide, please. I'm going to breathe. Okay, so Canada had been French, but the British had taken control. And we thought if we could get Canada, if we could take Canada, we could get those French Canadians on our side instead of the British. So there was this known plan to go up the Hudson River, up through Lake Champlain, and up to Montreal, send troops on that route to take Montreal. And then somebody had the idea to do this surprise attack on Quebec, going from Massachusetts and going on a Native American route up to Quebec. And they wanted this to be, so Arnold, Benedict Arnold, before he was a traitor and when he was still a hero, and he was really an amazing hero before he was a traitor, he volunteered to lead this expedition. And because they wanted to keep it a secret, it was called the Arnold expedition, to keep secret the fact that they were going to Quebec. So Benedict Arnold did all the planning, like organized the building of the bateaus and getting the provisions, the flour and the cattle and the salt pork, and getting all the volunteers together to be this, army to go up there. And sadly, it went poorly. The boats were made out of green wood, and so as they dried, they leaked. And so they're like bailing water out of the boats, but the flour in the barrels was getting wet and getting ruined. And then the boats didn't do well in the rapids. They tipped over. Everyone was cold and wet. The weather was colder than they thought. Took them longer to get there than they thought. Everything went wrong. So by the time they got there, it was like November, December. And, it's snowing, and some of them had starved to death, and some of them had turned around and gone back. Just a little more than half of the group actually made it to Quebec. And so it's kind of comical, but they weren't not in any really good shape to attack Quebec. But they decided on New Year's Eve that they had to do it that day, because a lot of their volunteers had enlisted for the year, and they couldn't make them do anything after New Year's Eve. So on New Year's Eve, they attacked Quebec, and it went badly. They totally lost. They totally lost. Many of them were imprisoned. It was, a complete failure. But before you call it a complete failure, the thing is, so 1775, they go up there, they have their terrible battle. 1776 comes along, and they're sending more British troops over from England, and they come over, and because of the Battle of Quebec, that now it's out in the open, some of them were sent down the St. Lawrence River to Quebec to be, stationed there, and others of them were sent to New York. So it kind of split the British troops. And in the spring, when the ice went out, they came down the river to Lake Champlain, and there was a bunch of battles there. And even though we lost those battles, there wasn't really any ground gained on either side, and everybody kind of like hunkered down for the winter, and waited. And then in 1777, those same partial British troops were in a battle at Saratoga, and the British surrendered. We won. Like, they lost, because it was just partial British troops. And so even though the attack on Quebec was a complete failure, there are people that say that win at Saratoga sort of like turned the course of the Revolutionary War. So you could say that because Arnold's march went to Quebec, it was really a success, because it split those British troops and it turned the course of the war. So that's how Arnold is heroic. So we're going to go to the next slide. Now, the super exciting thing about Arnold's March is it happened right here in Maine. And if you drove just 3 hours and 15 minutes, you could come to where we maintain the, in quotes, Great Carry. So the Great Carry, if Arnold's men had stayed in those bateaus and stayed on the water route, when they got up here to where we live, they would have followed this long river route all the way over here. And this wasn't Flagstaff Lake then, this was the Dead River. But they would take this big loop. And up here, there's rapids, it's difficult and it's long. So instead, they take this shortcut. They leave the Kennebec River, haul those bateaus over to East Carry Pond, boat across it, haul them to Middle Carry Pond, boat across it right up into that little inlet, hike, it's now the Appalachian Trail, over to West Carry Pond, boat across, and then go over to what was the Dead River. So that's a 12-mile hike, and you could hike it. And if you did, you would see these really cool trail markers that have a picture of the bateau on them. It's a fun trail. And we have painted orange blazes, but these are the fun ones. And you should definitely consider it. We had some guided hikes last year for the anniversary, and they were very well attended. So my husband Bob has flyers for our organization. I'm so sorry they didn't answer you, but we would answer you. Contact us, we'll answer you. But you should definitely come up and do the hikes. Okay, and next slide, please. And just to put it in perspective of where this is, you would just take 201 up through Skowhegan, and this says Moscow, but it's Bingham right here. It's Bingham, Moscow. And you would take the bridge over the river and then drive back roads up here. And, we'll have directions if you want to come do our hike. Okay. So the Arnold Expedition Historical Society, Bob and I are members. The mission is to preserve the history of this march, so we maintain that trail, and to also support research and do research to learn more about the march, and also do the really exciting metal detecting to find artifacts, which we found many exciting ones, and we know that there was a hospital site in this Middle Carey Pond region. So all kinds of fun stuff. But the research, the reason I didn't want to do it, but now Brad's making me do it, is because the research, most of the information that we have about what happened on the march comes from journals of the men that were on the march. And some of them were written in real time, like on the march, but some of them were written decades later, like more like a memoir. And also some information was gotten from pension statements, which that's, you're talking like probably 50 years after the march. Somebody is trying to recollect, what happened. And so you get different dates, you get different details, and you're not sure like which thing actually happened. Were they describing the same event? Was it two different events? Which day did it happen on? So it's difficult. And does anybody here do genealogy? Okay, so if you're looking up a marriage date or something, you might find names spelled differently, dates are different, in the different places you look. It's kind of like a rabbit hole. And my latest example, which irks me so much, is that each time I do my talk, I learn a little bit more, and just leave that. Wikipedia says that Benedict Arnold thought the march would take 20 days. And I used that in my talk in Fort Western. But Stephen Darley, in Voices Waiting to be Heard, says that Benedict Arnold predicted it would take 40 days and planned the provisions accordingly. So which thing is true? I certainly don't know. So all this is my disclaimer. Everything that I tell you today might be true, and it might not be true. It is my current understanding of the documents that I've read, and so you'll find that there are some things that have been updated since my last talk. And the more you look, the more crazy you go, because you're like, wait, I just read this. This happened. I know this happened because it said so. And then 2 months later, you read something else, and well, if that happened, then this couldn't have happened, and you'd just go nuts. So thus far, there have been published accounts of 2 women being on the march. But my friend George Quintel, and I hope you got a chance to hear him, discovered some documents that prove that there were 4 women on the march, and we have the name of the 3rd one. So we have Mrs. Warner, Mrs. Greer, and Mrs. Mitchell, and a 4th, like, unnamed woman. And George has looked and looked for the last decades and not found who she is. But we're still hoping. That's what makes it all so exciting. So over the years, I've learned that my husband Bob is an auditory learner. He likes to come to lectures like this and hear about history, and that's how he learns. And I'm like, no. I don't like to do that. I like to get right in there and do and get my hands dirty and learn by doing. And and to me, the learning is just so profound when you actually put yourselves in their shoes and you try to do what they did. So here's the first thing I learned. When you are walking in your moccasins, you will feel every single pebble and twig and everything that is on the ground. So after my first day of that, I put the very wrong insoles in. Don't tell anybody I have insoles in them. But if I were a better reenactor, there's a Townsend sells your lamb's wool proper insole that you should have had. So that's what I learned. So my husband, Bob, did a very exciting reenactment of the paddling from Augusta all the way up to the Canadian border. I just learned the other day it was 17 days of travel to paddle the whole route, and I helped him with the Great Carry. And let's have the next slide. Because the first thing I learned is when it rains, you will get wet. And you will see, there he is, rain, 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 rain. And that happened a lot on the march. That's part of what went wrong for them, is they were all wet and cold. So I was pretty excited about helping him with this trip. I guess we can go to the next slide. Bob and I maintain that trail, so we know that trail. And it's 12 miles long. We're experienced hikers. And the trail is routed such that you can walk around the pond, so you can do it all on foot, which we've done many times. And I was thinking, wow, now I get to do it with a boat, like the way you're supposed to do it, carry the boat through the wilderness. But I was dressed in my period clothing, but I did not have these moccasins. I had regular hiking boots on. And does anybody know how much a bateau weighs, those wooden boats they took? Well, not 1,200, thank God, but 400 pounds. They're 400 pounds. And our custom-made lightweight canoe is 48 pounds, so like a tenth of the weight of the bateaus. So we had that. We had a nice wheeled cart to bring our canoe on. And we had two friends with vehicles that took our heavy gear and drove them the 12 miles. So we didn't have to carry all of our stuff. We just had to, carry some of it. So here we are. Look at us. And here's, the orange and white signs for our trail. And this is the beginning before everything went really bad. But it was already pretty bad at this point, to tell you the truth. That wheeled cart, if there's boulders or there's bog bridges, you can't use that. So then poor Bob has to put the canoe on his head and carry the canoe. I have to carry the cart. And then we have to go back and get all the gear that was in the canoe and haul that too. So you end up, and this is what they had to do on the march, is make several trips, because it took 4 men to carry each bateau. And then they had to go back and get the gear. So the first section of the trail, it's 5 miles, and it goes just past East Carry Pond and it stops at Middle Carry Pond, was so arduous for us that we actually had to stop and have a rest day. Now I've told this a little bit out of order, but I will say that we definitely thought that we'd do those 12 miles in 2 days. That would be 6 miles a day, no problem. We got, the canoe is 48 pounds. We were so tired after those first 5 miles that we actually had to stop and have a rest day, stop, spend the night, the next whole day, sit on the porch, read books, rest, and then the next day complete those 12 miles. So it took us 3 days to go 12 miles. That's 4 miles a day. And guess what? That is what they averaged on the actual march, carrying the 400-pound bateaus. So by doing this reenactment, it just makes you have a respect and an admiration for what they did on the march, because it was really hard. I mean, it was really hard for us, even though we had all these advantages. We had good weather. We weren't wet and cold. We had plenty of food still. So we're done with this, and this can go off, and the lights can come back on, and I can breathe. Of the carry? Oh, I'm sorry, 180 miles. It was 180 miles. And, when you think that he thought they would do 20 days, that would have been 9 miles a day. But the other guy says, no, he thought it would take 40 days. So which is it? I don't know. Yes, it started with 1,100 men. And by the time they got to Quebec, it was a little over 600. So they had like 54% of the men completed the march. And I don't say survived the march, because hundreds of them actually turned back. Hundreds of them said, there's not enough food, this is not going to work, we're just going to turn back. And they turned back with a lot of food. That also went over very poorly, although you could argue that they didn't want to die, so that's why they turned back. And they didn't desert the army. They went and they fought other battles. But, Bob.
The backhouse would be heavily laden with gear and everything. So there was roughly 4 people per bateau, but we think that 2 people would have been in the bateau and the others would have been marching along the banks and helping the portages.
So how many bateaus were originally started on this expedition?
Reuben Colbert and Pittston had orders to build 200, and Benedict Arnold got to Pittston, and he said theirs are too small, so in short order, Reuben Colbert built 220 more, so it was 220. That's all I needed to know.
But a lot of them got busted up, and then finally some of them got abandoned. It did not go well for them. So now I'm just going to talk about how I started reenacting. As I say, I wasn't really interested in going to lectures, but I wanted to have a reenactment outfit, and so I started by sewing. And sewing is a reenactment because I'm doing what those women did in the 1700s, when they made their clothing, and it gives me a connection to them. So in the journals, there's not much mention of what they were wearing. So the information that I have about the clothing, I got mostly from 2 books. One of them is Beth Gilgan's Tidings from the 18th Century, which gave me patterns. Great book. I've taken it out of the library several times. And I also have another book, Whatever Shall I Wear, by Mara Riley. And both of these are where I've gotten my information about the clothing. So I could use your assistance now. So the clothing that I'm wearing right now, this is called a shift. And this was your nightgown, and it was your underwear, and you just kept it on all the time, 24 hours a day. They didn't shower every day like we did. So this is what and it's made out of linen. And linen wants to fray. Do you see how there's it wants to fray? So when you're sewing linen, you have to do a flat felled seam. You can't have any raw edges. So you sew your first seam with the material offset. So you have your short piece and your longer piece, and you sew that first seam, and then you take out your iron. And you learn, the minute you put that iron on the linen, linen irons so well. It's the best stuff in the world. So you iron this flat, so your long piece is over your short piece. And then you fold it under. And you stitch it a second time. So this makes the kind of seam that you would have in your blue jeans. And the man's shirt serves the same purpose. The man's shirt is his nightgown and his undergarment as well. And I'm going to pass this around so you can get a look at the flat-felled seams. And there's also all these other ingenious things to prevent the ripping of any of these places that are, open. There's something sewn in there, and on the pattern in the book said to put them on the inside, so I have them on the inside, these triangles which prevent the seam from ripping. But I thought they were so exciting that I made myself a blouse with the same pattern so that I could put the triangles on the outside and show them off because they're very attractive. But anyway, I'm going to pass this around, and you can take that. I think I'm good now. So the other thing is, you really couldn't waste. You couldn't go down to Joann Fabric and just buy more fabric. You had to make do with what you had, and you really didn't want to waste any of it. So the triangles that were cut from the top of this to make the top more narrow are sewn into the bottom to make the bottom more wide. Anybody sew here? Yeah, okay. So every seam on this is a flat felt seam. Every one of these 3 seams between the triangles. And it's a pleasure. I love to sew. So there isn't much documentation about what they would be wearing under this. They didn't write things like we did. They didn't write directions down. The recipes are kind of hard to follow because they just say, take this and do this, and they're not really specific. But we don't know what they had on underneath this. But according to this book and some other authorities, they think there was nothing, no pantaloons, no nothing, that this was just it. So keep that in mind. So when you got up in the morning wearing your nightgown and underwear, the first thing that you would put on would be your corset, except, and this is also called jumps or stays, corsets were not worn in certain situations, such as being on the frontier. That's what that book says. And so Arnold's March surely counts as the frontier, so I don't wear one as a reenactor. That's not part of my outfit. And all I could find out about stockings was that they should be long enough to go up over your knee and that they should have garter stitch at the top. So I dutifully got some undyed yarn from a friend of mine that raises sheep and knitted these. And they don't stay up really well. I'm not going to put them on today for a lot of reasons. But I've since learned that I should have used thinner yarn and smaller needles, smaller than size 1, and knitted really tight to make stockings that would be more likely to stay up. So anyway, these are my stockings. Okay. Now, a lot of where people get their information about what people were wearing in the 1700s is from pictures, because as I say, there wasn't a whole lot of documentation about what they were wearing. And in a lot of those pictures, you see that the shoes that they have on, men and women, are those black shoes with the buckles. But I have been told, let me preface this, let me give my disclaimer here. I have references for almost everything that I say, and I was told, do your own research, don't ask other, reenactors about things, but I have done that. So some of my information comes from other reenactors. And I was told by one of those reenactors that at the time of Arnold's March, you would be wearing moccasins. And I since learned from another reenactor that you would be wearing the kind of moccasins that were worn by the Indian tribes in your area. And he sent me a map that showed me the different styles of moccasins. So I Googled a moccasin pattern, and I got a moccasin pattern. And I'm going to pass this around also. I don't know where to start. But I bought some leather, and I watched a YouTube. And it's surprisingly easy to make moccasins. First of all, the leather cuts with scissors. I didn't realize it would be that easy to cut. And you can force a needle through it, although I got a hole puncher. So in Arundel, which is a fictionalized story about Arnold's March, they made shoes on the march. And I haven't found it in the journals yet, but it's credible to me. It was pretty easy to make these. If they had moose hide or any kind of, hide, it doesn't take long to cut them out and stitch them up, and there you've got something on your feet. And by the end of the march, the men were just in rags. Some of them were like in sock feet. I mean, it was, they probably, I like to think that they made some on the march. So I got these made and I started wearing them in reenactment events. And has anyone been on a hike and accidentally got themselves up into ankle-deep mud? And then you're trying to pull your foot out and you don't even know if your boot's going to come out with your foot. Well, I looked at these moccasins and I said to another reenactor who's a genius, these don't seem like they'd be really good. And, they were in a lot of mud in Arnold's march. And what I learned from her was these flaps I would have made much longer so that the moccasins would have come up my leg, and then you would have your woolen gaiters around them, which would have held them on. So maybe I'll make some someday. So the next item is a pocket. Men's pockets are stitched into their breeches, but women's pockets are a separate item. And sometimes these are beautifully embroidered and they're intended to be worn on the outside, but skirts are actually designed such that the pocket can be worn on the inside, and that's where I wear mine. And the pocket, again, it's just linen, and turns out you can make your own bias tape. If you just cut linen on the diagonal instead of cutting it with the grain, you can make this piece of linen that will go around a curve, and you can sew it around the outside of your pocket. So this is my pocket. I'm going to put that on. And what do I have in my pocket? Well, in case I needed to write anything down, I have my little leather pouch with paper. And my pencil, which doesn't seem to want to stay with it. And I have my thread cutters that I got at Fort Western, merely for the sound. But you'll find that these will be part of my talk. And the last thing I have, this is my favorite thing. This is a little wooden container of pins. So it looks like a straight pin, and it's got a round head, but this is called a common pin. And these were used for women's clothing to hold them shut, as you'll see once I get the rest of my outfit on. They were used for sewing, and they were also used as paper clips in the household. So common pins, very important. So the next thing I'm going to put on is my petticoat. Now, I always thought of a petticoat as being something you wear under something, but no, apparently it looks like a skirt, but it's called a petticoat. This is merely 2 rectangles of material sewn at the flat felt seam, and then drawstring at the top. And it's open on each side 7 inches. This is what I said about this, is because that's where you're going to put your hand into your pocket. So I'm going to put this on. Yes, this is linen, but it could be either linen or wool.
Were there particular colors or patterns to this coat?
Well, I asked a lot about color before I bought this stuff. And the person that I think is the smartest, the most genius, Susan Reedy, if anyone knows her, she's a reenactor extraordinaire, told me the only color I could not have would be red. That would be wrong. And they wore a lot of brown and gray, you know. But she said if you happen to have indigo, then you could have blue. So I hope I had indigo because I like the blue. So you just could reach into your pocket, you know, get whatever you needed. The next item I'm going to put on is my short gown, which is like a little jacket. And this is made of wool, and the pattern is ingenious. It's just like folded over, and the arms are just sewn down the sides. So it's made out of a single piece of material, and these pleats on the inside make the little ruffle that will show in the back once I get the whole thing on. Now, if you look at pictures from the 1700s, you will see that every person, men and women, has some kind of a scarf around their neck. Sometimes it's made of silk, but my character couldn't afford it. And it can also be made out of linen. So mine is linen. This is the bleached linen. I figured I had just enough money to get this. I'm going to pin this all in place with my common pin. And then the last thing I'm going to put on is going to be my apron. Now your apron, you did not put on like when you're going in the kitchen. You wore it all the time. And this is what holds the bottom of my short gown shut. Although I'm also told you could have a number of more pins, but you can use your apron to hold it shut. So your apron was just like a working part of your household. It was your pot holder to take stuff out of the oven. You might carry wood in, holding it like this. You might clean things with it. It's your dish towel. It's your everything. So your apron was worn all the time. And my hair. I'm going to pass around. Again, it's online, but this is part of the instructions for 1770s hairstyle and headgear. And what you basically do is you put a long ribbon around your neck and you hold half of it in your mouth while you're braiding the other side so it doesn't pull to that side. But I don't know if you can see that the ribbon is braided right into my hair. And once you get down to the end of the braid, you use that ribbon to tie the end because, of course, you don't have elastics. And then wrap, and tie. You wrap it around your head and tie it on top, and now you have this hairstyle that keeps your hair out of the way. And then I haven't done it yet, but you would make your bonnet. And your bonnet would fit on right over these braids, and the bonnet would kind of hold the braids in place, and the braids would hold the bonnet in place. And I'll get to that sometime. But what I find fascinating about this hairstyle is that before I was a reenactor, years before that, I hiked the Appalachian Trail. And I had this, long hair. And while I was out there, I came around to, it was too hard to brush my hair in the back because it got all staticky in the cold and everything. The two braids in the front were easier to braid when I was just out there in the wilderness. And then I would wrap the braids around my head and put a baseball hat on and tuck them up under it. And that's how I wore my hair. So it's extremely credible to me that maybe they wore the hair like this. It works. But it's just as credible to me that they might have just worn it in a braid down the back. And also, there's no records of this at all, but, some women on the Appalachian Trail just cut the hair short. And maybe they did that. Who knows? So my last item, Bob and I were fortunate to be able to participate in a reenactment of just those 12 miles with a bunch of reenactors from out of state who were amazing, carried the muskets, they had like all the gear. And they all had canvas like backpacks that they carried that would have been issued by the Army. And so I said to one of them, well, what would a woman have been carrying? She wouldn't have been issued, that she wouldn't have been having military stuff. And he said, a market wallet. A market wallet. And I'm going to show you what it is. A market wallet. It's just a rectangle of linen folded in on each side and seamed down the middle, but you leave a hole so that you can put stuff in it, and you do your flat felt seam on the end. And I'm going to put some stuff in it. I brought some apples. Apples would not have been on the march because apples were like a cultivated crop. So before I went on the march, I went to market and I bought some apples. So you put your stuff in and then you twist it to close that hole in the middle. And you throw it over your shoulder, and this is your market wallet. It's like a shopping bag. And when we did those guided hikes last fall, it really felt terrible to have this whole outfit on and then like have a plastic water bottle or, or some like modern thing. So now we can hide our car keys and stuff in our market wallets. So now you know what I would have had on. Oh, and I should have mentioned about the petticoat. And you asked, and mine is made of linen. When it was winter, you would throw on another petticoat, or maybe 2 or 3. You just have enough layers on that you'd be warm, and they might be made of wool to keep you warm. So I don't know who of you saw me carrying my outfit in here. It's heavy. When I have it all on, and this is just with a single petticoat, it feels kind of heavy. So just keep in mind that it was cold and wet on the march, and they were probably wearing lots of petticoats. So Brad asked me what the women were doing on the march. so I did some research, and my friend George Quintel pointed me to the right resources. But, today, you think like, imagine a spouse like following somebody into combat. we don't do that. There's regulations against that, and there's OSHA. There's it's unheard of. But when I started looking, I learned that this is sort of more recent, that like the nurses in the Army are enlisted. They're a part of the Army. For centuries before the Revolutionary War, women were coming along with men with the Army and doing service. They were doing laundry, they were mending things, they were cooking, they were doing all the things that women do. And surprisingly, laundry was like extremely important, because even though Florence Nightingale didn't come along for another 100 years, it's still true that in the Revolutionary War, a lot of the deaths were from infections, and one of them was typhus. And typhus is spread by fleas and other like little small bugs. And so doing the laundry and boiling like the linens and stuff is actually infection control. So the women have been providing service to armies long before the Revolutionary War. So in the Revolutionary War, the British had this organized, trained army with a clear chain of command from the king on down. They knew what they were doing. But we were like not even a country yet. We were just trying to cobble together a bunch of volunteers and make an army. And most of this information, by the way, I'll just credit, comes from the book Belonging to the Army, Camp Followers and Community During the American Revolution, written by Holly Mayer. So in her book, she says some of these volunteers didn't necessarily want to leave their families. And George Washington didn't really want camp followers. He thought they were a distraction. He didn't really want them there, but he had to balance not wanting the camp followers with wanting the volunteers. This was kind of a big issue, and it just like stunned me to find out they had FMLA back then. Like if you had a family issue at home, you could ask for leave from the Army to go home and take care of your father's estate after he died, or take care of your wife after she broke both her arms or whatever. So George Washington, he didn't like the camp followers, but he kind of couldn't do without them. So he thought, all right, if they're going to be there, then at least let's make them work. So that's how they got to the laundry and the cooking and being nurses. Now, I'm a nurse, so I like to think about what it means to be a nurse. Well, as I said, Florence Nightingale didn't come along till the Crimean War, and in 1860 is when she opened a nursing school. Back in the Revolutionary War, it's on-the-job training. So if they couldn't get a woman to be a nurse, they would have to take a soldier out of the line of duty and make him be a nurse. And the work wasn't really pleasant. There's a description, I have to read this. There was a hospital serving Mount Independence in Ticonderoga, and it was described by one of the doctors there as crowded into a dirty, lousy, and by the way, that means lice, stinking hospital, enough to kill well men. And there were other descriptions of hospitals with the operating rooms, with blood on the floor and amputated limbs lying around. I mean, it was unpleasant. And the nurses' work was basically hygiene and housekeeping. So they were bathing these men and sweeping the floors and apparently sprinkling vinegar on them. And all this in 1775 for $2 a month, whereas the enlisted men were getting $6.33 a month. So you certainly wanted a nurse doing that work for the cheaper wage, right? Rather than taking your soldier out of the line of duty and making him do it. So there was a lot of reason for women to be in encampments and following the armies. Now, specific to Arnold's March, we've got a slightly different thing going on, because this wasn't like an encampment. This was a march. So it's likely that they weren't doing much laundry, because every day they had to make progress. You couldn't stop and do laundry and hang it out. So I'm not sure they were doing laundry, but I am sure that they were doing mending, and cooking and tending the ill and the wounded. Now, there's this description of the limbs on the floor. There was a hospital built at Middle Carey Pond, and that's one of the exciting things that we found with the metal detecting. We know the site of the hospital. But that hospital was built because so many of the men right around there, I guess the water in some of the ponds was not good to drink, but so many of the men had dysentery that they had to have a hospital to care for them there. So that was just cleaning up excrement, and taking care of men like that. And the 3 of the women that we know were on the march were actually in regiments that were ahead of the time that the time and the place that hospital was built. So we don't think that they worked there, and we don't know about the 4th woman. But we think that they would have been cooking, mending, and tending. And there was lots of illness. I just can't believe it. Like there was smallpox. There was this dysentery. There was a lot of need for the care of a good woman. And what were they cooking and eating on Arnold's March? Well, in the beginning, they would have had flour, cattle, salted pork, oatmeal, rum, cornmeal, and other provisions. And so every evening for dinner, they could be expected to be eating some kind of meat and some kind of like cake or bread. And one of the types of cake, which we don't really know if they ate on the march, but they definitely ate in the 1700s, because I have an old recipe, was something called Johnny cake. And Johnny cake, and I'll put this on your snack table out there. It's like a kind of a cornbread that's made out of mostly cornmeal, a little bit of flour, milk, molasses, and butter. And they wouldn't have had milk. They would have had molasses. You mix this up, and if you were going to eat it right away, you would cook it in like some kind of grease, and it would be warm and soft and good. But if you were going to carry it in your pocket for your lunch that day, you cooked it like I did in a dry pan so that it was not crumbly. It was kind of like harder. So I wouldn't say these are the greatest tasting thing in the world, but I did bring them for you to try. And if you were hungry on Arnold's March, I'm sure you would have wanted to eat them. So in the beginning, they were eating well, but as I said, those barrels of flour got wet. Some of them got washed downstream. They started the march October 1st. And by November, many of their provisions had run out, that the whole regiment had turned around. I don't know when they turned around, but they took a lot of the food anyway. By the time they got to like November, the men were sometimes, and this is in the journals, it's not pretty, they were sometimes just mixing some flour with water and making a kind of a paste and eating that. Or sometimes they were mixing the flour with water and boiling it and eating that. And who here has a dog? Everyone raise your hand if you've got a dog. Do you like your dog? Because they were so desperate and so starving that they did actually kill and eat at least one dog on the march. So they were relying on also any wild game, any fish, any fowl, an occasional moose that they could get. And another problem with that is when you're eating protein, and not getting enough carbohydrate, it's the Atkins diet. Your body goes into ketosis, and you lose weight. So by like mid-November, in some of those journals, some of them were in stocking feet, and they were just like starving. And they actually got to the point where some of the men were like kind of too weak to go along. They were like dropping and like dying on the sidelines. And the leaders finally had to say, you can't help them. It's like every man for himself. You've got to just, if you can walk, keep going. And this really traumatized some of those men that there were their comrades, their people that they knew that were saying, don't leave us, we're too weak, but they had to. The march, it was really a very intense, difficult thing. And they also reportedly cooked shoe leather. That's how desperate they were to eat. And Bob and I, it's in Arundel. Arundel is a fictionalized account of it, but they talk a lot about that in Arundel, how the men would argue about the best way to cook shoe leather. Did you char it over the fire first? Did you just boil it? And then there's a video from the 1970s from the 200th anniversary when they acted out a bunch of this stuff, and it's really pretty funny, them trying to like eat that shoe leather. Well, it wasn't funny on the march, but it's funny in the video. So who are the women? So Kenneth Roberts published a book, March to Quebec, and in that book are many of these journals. And so from these journals, we know about Mrs. Greer and Mrs. Warner. And on Mrs. Greer, John Joseph Henry's journal from November 1st, 1775, states, entering the pond, Simpson foremost, and breaking the ice here and there with the butts of our guns or our feet as occasion required, we were soon waist deep in water. If there's ice in that water's cold, okay? Waist deep in the mud and water. As is generally the case with youths, it came to my mind that a better path might be found than that of the more elderly guide. Attempting this, in a trice, the water cooled my armpits. Made me gladly return into the file. Now Mrs. Greer had got before me. My mind was humbled, yet astonished at the exertions of this good woman. Her clothing, more than waist high, she waded before me to firm ground. No one, so long as she was known to us, dared imitate a disrespectful idea of her. So now, I want you to just think about, I gotta rearrange myself here for a minute. If I had 3 or 4 wool petticoats on, and those petticoats got wet, and that night I'm gonna sleep in those, and wool never dries, I'm gonna sleep in those wet petticoats, I'd be in big trouble. And so you can see why she would completely expose herself as one of these few women in this whole crowd of men. It must have been very uncomfortable, but that's how desperate they were to survive. That's how bad it was out there. So that's Mrs. Greer, and sadly that's about the only thing we know about her. That's the only entry about her in the journals. Now this same man, John Joseph Henry, writes on Mrs. Warner in that same day. We were at the point of entering the marsh when someone called out, "Warner is not here." Another said he had sat down sick under a tree a few miles back. His wife begged us to wait a short time, and with tears of affection in her eyes, ran back to her husband. Then, the next day, on November 2nd, Abner Stocking writes in his journal, but he doesn't give a name. He says, in quotes, his affectionate wife tarried by him until he died, while the rest of the company proceeded on their way. Having no implements with which she could bury him, she covered him with leaves and then took his gun and other implements and left him with a heavy heart. After traveling 20 miles, she came up with us. Now, when we did that reenactment last fall with those reenactors from out of state who had the muskets and everything, I said to one of them, "Can I hold the musket for a minute?" They are so heavy. They're like at least 10 pounds. So this woman, whose husband had just died, and normally when your husband dies, you get 3 paid days off from work, and you go to, your hospice support group, you have time to process this. She had to just be with him until he died and jump up and catch up with the rest of the group and wade through that waist-deep water to get there. I mean, that's the terrain she had to go on. And I can't imagine why, and if she had just despaired and stayed with him, she would have died. no food, died of exposure. I mean, these were like really desperate times. So I would say Jemima Warner is just like well loved. You just, every time you see something about Arnold's March, she is always in it because people just love that story. But it's really amazing. Her husband died and she jumped up and caught up. And, you know, I hiked 20-mile days when I was on the Appalachian Trail, but I was not wearing petticoats. And when you're wearing petticoats, every time you come to a blowdown, you got to like lift it up and step over it. And it snags on everything, and then you trip, and then that takes more time. So it's astounding to me that she did this. So the book March to Quebec was published in 1938 with the information that was available in 1938. So since then, well, maybe not since 1938, but our friend George Quintel has been researching all the people that were on the march, and he's got all these charts that tell like the ages and whether they were married or not, all this stuff about them. He came across a pension statement from Robert Mitchell, and this is an 1818 pension statement. And the testimony says, accompanied by my wife, who was one of 4 women. So now we know, Kenneth Roberts thought there were only 2 women, but now we know there was 4. And we know that 3 of their names. We don't know the 4th one's name. So Robert Mitchell was born September 6, 1741. And my lovely friend George gave me a stack about this thick of documents about this couple, and I had to wade through that whole thing, and I couldn't find a record of her birth, but I deduced that she was born in 1755 based on the age she was when she applied for her pension. They were married in July of 1773, so on the march they were married for 2 years. They were newlyweds, and he would have been 34 years old and she would have been 20, and he was a drum major. Now we're going to jump to 1926. I don't know how George finds these things. There's a letter from Winifred Scott. And by the way, when I talk up my friend George, a lot of these documents that he's reading are handwritten like this. And I'm going to pass this around. See if you would feel like reading this kind of writing for hours at a time. So anyway, in 1927, there's this letter from Winifred Scott stating about Robert Mitchell. He was in the Battle of Quebec and was captured January 1, 1776, and held until the following spring, when he was sent to New York and exchanged and returned to Winchester. His wife accompanied him to Quebec and returned to Winchester with him. So he applied for a pension in 1818 at age 78, and he was awarded $8 a month, which is $96 a year, which he received until his death in 1827. He lived to be 87 and collected a total of $892. I just love numbers. So Eve applied for a pension in 1839, and I think, first of all, why did she wait 12 years after his death? And second of all, how did she support herself? I just, it's all this fascinating things that you wish you knew. So she applied in 1839 and she received $80 a year. Now he got 96, but she got 80. But there's other pension records, and here's the rabbit hole, that show different start dates for her pension from 1836 to 1843. And I couldn't find a date of her death, but there's records that show that she was still living in 1848 in Belmont County, Ohio at age 93. So she marched those 180 miles in the cold and the wet and all that stuff, and she lived to be an old woman. Pretty happy about that. So we know what happened to Eve, but what happened to the other women? This is the latest thing I've been trying to research. On December 11th, 1775, Caleb Haskell, in his journal, says, "Today we had a man wounded and a woman killed by a shot from the city." Now, in that book, March to Quebec, Kenneth Roberts makes a note on that page because that book is mostly the journals, but also his notes about what he thinks. And in his note, he says that Mrs. Greer was killed April 18th. I'll get to that journal entry. And so it must have been Jemima Warner that was killed December 11th because there was only 2 women on the march. But now we know that there weren't just 2 women on the march. So it's just not that simple. And now we know, thanks to George Quintel, Mrs. Warner was also connected with the Pennsylvania troops. So it could have been either one of them that was killed in April, and we really don't know who was killed in December. And just to make you really crazy, if you read the whole march to Quebec, you would find, and I'm putting an article in our newsletter about this, there's a number of other journal entries, December 9th, December 10th, and December 11th, all talking about a single woman being killed. For example, December 11th, this is Dearborn, did no other damage than killing an old Canadian woman. And here's one from December 10th. The enemy keep a continual fire all day, which set a number of houses on fire and killed a French woman. So here you go. Were women killed in all 3 of those days? 3 different women? Was it one woman killed, but they had the wrong dates? Was it Jemima that was killed? There's no name. Was it the Canadian woman? We don't know. Also, when I was trying to determine if it was actually Jemima that was killed then, I came across one of our own newsletters, the Arnold Expedition Historical Society, dated 1985, that says, with no references at all, that Jemima Warner not only survived, but she married a second time in 1783 in Philadelphia. So I dutifully went to the library and I tried to get into the Philadelphia, because there's a date and a name. There's an exact date, an exact place, and an exact name. You should be able to find a record of that marriage. So Philadelphia public records only go back to 1860. But there's a book that I found that lists marriages before 1790. And I was able to find an online version of that book. And it's indexed by the names. And I used the name of the man she reportedly married, Mr. Knorr. And I used the name Warner. And I used the name Greer because this 1985 newsletter also said she was the daughter of the Greers. But there's no way to prove that. Anyway, could not find a record of that. So we don't know. We don't know if she was killed in Quebec or not, but it seems likely that she did arrive in Quebec and that Mrs. Greer arrived in Quebec because somebody was shot April 18th, and we know Mrs. Mitchell made it to Quebec. So we know that at least 3 out of the 4 women made it to Quebec. And I don't say survived to Quebec because, as I say, hundreds of the men turned around and went back. So, but when you think that 54% of the men arrived in Quebec and 75% of the women, even though 4 is too small of a number to draw data from, if you're a data person, still the women were the better completers of the march. And how could that be? So I looked up that, and one of the descriptions of Mrs. Greer is a large, virtuous, and respectable woman. So large, right? Because they were starving. It turns out that even when women are not large, but they're like regular size, they have a higher percentage of body fat than men. And so statistically, they survive famine 40% longer. So the women had that as an advantage. And I keep having more questions. The more research you do, the more you realize you don't know and you want to know. So every time I do a presentation, I end my presentation with the questions I have because I learn something. So I always wanted to know, like, why do men's clothing have buttons? His clothing, I made him a pair of breeches, 19 buttonholes. But why do men's clothing have buttons and women's don't? And Linda Novak at Fort Western told me it was because women had to get pregnant. So they had to have, somebody said at my last talk, one size fits all for the drawstring skirt. Yes, you had to be able to get bigger and smaller. So how did women keep from getting pregnant on the march? In Holly Mayer's book, women did get pregnant when they were following the army. And that's why he didn't like them being there, because there's women, there's kids running around, they're a distraction. He didn't like that, but they did. So, you know, Mrs. Mitchell was 20 years old. Jemima was supposedly either 16 or 17, no proof of either of those. They were fertile. Were any of them pregnant on the march? And why do men's clothing have pockets that are sewn in, and why are women's a separate item? So this is the end of my presentation, and I welcome your answers to my questions and any of your questions that you may have. Yeah. Yes. Thank you.